and it's a delight to welcome you to this seminar. First, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land Monash University is positioned, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today's seminar is a slightly different format. We actually have 4 presenters or 5 presenters in 4 parts in the seminar. I'll do an introduction to the Australian Precision Medicine Enterprise. Then I'll invite a speaker from Global Medical Solutions, Danny Bucki-Smith. Then we'll hand across to David, Cade and Jyoti Arora from Telix Pharmaceuticals. And then Maggie Aulsebrook here at Monash Biomedical Imaging will end the presentations. We'd be happy to take questions from the audience through the Q&A button and function. So please put your questions up there. We'll probably try and take one question at the end of each presentation if there is one. And then we'll have a panel discussion and open Q&A at the end of the 4 presentations. Let me kick things off and give you a very broad overview of the Australian Precision Medicine Enterprise, which is a joint project between Monash University, Global Medical Solutions and Telix Pharmaceuticals. We were very lucky recently to receive approval from the federal government for a grant that was submitted last year under the Modern Manufacturing Initiative Manufacturing Collaboration Stream for the establishment of a commercial manufacturing facility for radiopharmaceuticals. And the motivation behind the APME is the fact that there is a very rapidly growing both need and opportunity from a clinical perspective for new diagnostic and therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals. And furthermore, there's a rapidly expanding portfolio of compounds which are going through early and later stage clinical trial work, which require both clinical testing capabilities as well as ultimately commercial manufacturing capabilities. And Australia is in a very strong position in this discipline. Australia is a world leader in nuclear medicine and pharmaceutical sciences, and we're in a strong position nationally to address these opportunities and clinical needs. But we have had a problem in Australia over the past decade or so with the absence of a significant high-energy cyclotron and the associated radiochemistry and radiopharmaceutical facilities. And this has really hampered both our reliability of supply of existing clinical nuclear medicine products, as well as opportunities to advance the clinical trialling and ultimately commercialization of compounds for future use. So we recognise this need. We reached out to our industry partners nationally to engage with them and to understand how they felt that we could address this national need, and also to provide opportunities to produce commercially for our region in Asia Pacific and more generally. So we particularly at the university have a focus on the research and development opportunities that will come by having this facility, which will include both a commercial high-energy cyclotron manufacturing capability, as well as a research and development medium-energy cyclotron capability. And this will give the university opportunities to both do fundamental chemistry research, we'll hear a little bit more about that later in the session, as well as preclinical imaging research, which is now well established and underway at 2 sites at Clayton and Arora, and also then, of course, first-in-man phase 1 human clinical trial work. So that's the background to the university and its industry partnerships. And this is just some evidence in the past couple of years of the opportunities that are here and the need that can be addressed with these new diagnostic and therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals or theranostic compounds. In the top left here, you see a paper from Michael Hoffman and colleagues from the Peter Mac a couple of years ago that showed the dramatic reduction in metastases and disease in 4 different men with prostate cancer following lutetium PSMA therapy. And the combination of both gallium-68 PSMA imaging diagnostically and then lutetium PSMA therapeutic treatments has really, I think, really demonstrated the power of this new paradigm. And on the right, a number of other indications where Telix, in fact, have very strong positions, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. Across the bottom, I've used some information here from recently another commercial entered in Australia, Clarity Pharmaceuticals, that are pioneering the development of copper labelled antibodies for both diagnostic and therapeutic treatments in a number of different indications, and just further demonstrates the real energy and opportunities that exist here in the Australian sector. So, as I mentioned, the APME is a partnership between GMS, which we'll hear about from Danny in a minute, Telix, which was founded here in Melbourne a few years ago now, and Monash University. It's a terrific partnership between a university as a fundamental R&D partner, a commercial manufacturing organisation such as GMS, and then a late-stage clinical development and commercialisation company such as Telix. And we were very pleased that our proposal, which had both state and some other separate federal government funding support, was approved by the Department of Industry just last month in April. As well as the three key partners, we've also had very broad support from the community nationally, both from healthcare providers, including Genesis Care, the Austin Hospital, the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Institute, Alfred Health and Monash Heart, and we really appreciated that support at the time. The industry professional bodies, including the Australian and New Zealand Society for Nuclear Medicine, as well as the Australian Radiopharmaceutical Trials Network, again recognised that the proposal we put forward is addressing a national need and providing really important opportunities for the national community. We had great support from both the National Imaging Facility and also from ANSTO in our submission to the federal government. So what will the APME be? At its heart, it's a high-energy cyclotron, as shown here on this slide. It provides a unique source nationally for certain radioisotopes, both single photon-emitting radioisotopes for SPECT work, as well as PET emitters, and also potentially some other beta and alpha emitters. So it's got great diversity and breadth. At the university, we have an interest in the first stage to be producing fluorine, copper, and carbon-11 for our internal research and development work in early stage clinical trial. And then in a later stage, hopefully not too much later, production of ammonia, zirconium, and potentially gallium-68. We see these as being the early stage first radioisotopes for production. And here you see a number of radiopharmaceuticals listed, which will be for our research use within the hospitals and the university. As I mentioned, the facility will actually have two cyclotrons, a medium to high energy cyclotron, as well as a 30 MeV cyclotron, to enable us to have a balance between both the research and development requirements and the commercial manufacturing opportunities. It will be physically located in Clayton in Melbourne. It's going to be on the Monash Biomedical Imaging site, which is immediately opposite the Victorian Heart Hospital, which is nearing completion for its construction. And it will be also developed at the same time as another development at the MBI site for the Victorian Health Innovation Centre, which is being built in conjunction with the Heart Hospital. There'll be separate spaces for R&D labs, the medium energy cyclotron, and then the commercialisation labs. But these two will operate as an integrated facility to really maximise the efficiencies and opportunities of the two cyclotron and R&D and commercial manufacturing labs. So the program is underway. We have been spending the last 2 or 3 years establishing the initial research and development facility, and then with the recent announcement of the APME grant, we're now underway for the full design development for the facility, hopefully by the end of this year or early next year, and then going out to tender and commencing construction in mid-2023, with a hope that that will be completed by about mid-2025, so roughly a 2-year program for the development of the facility. And we hope it will have some initial R&D operations late in 2025, and then commercial manufacturing will hopefully be well underway by the beginning of 2026. So that's the brief overview from my side around the APME, and I'll stop sharing my screen at this point. So as I said, if anybody has any questions, please pop them up in the Q&A box and we'll address them as we go along. I'd now like to introduce Danny Bucki-Smith from Global Medical Solutions to give us an overview from GMS's perspective. Danny, it's great having you join our seminar, and it's really great to know that you've just recently been appointed as National Infrastructure Implementation and Development Manager for GMS Australia. So great, congratulations on that appointment, and we look forward to working with you in the next few years. Over to you, Danny.
Thank you very much, Gary. I've just got to work out what my title actually means and then we'll be fine. Thank you very much also, Gary, for a very comprehensive overview of the APME and how we've got to where we are now. And thanks for the opportunity to speak today. This is really a very, very exciting venture, the APME, and really it's a game changer for molecular imaging and therapy in Australia. So for those of you that don't know about Global Medical Solutions Australia or GMSA, I'll be introducing you to us. I'll outline who we are, what we do, why we're involved in the APME, and why we believe it is so important. So Global Medical Solutions Australia is the Australian operation of Global Medical Solutions International, GMS, and we operate centralised radio pharmacies around Australia, and we provide routine diagnostic and therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals to nuclear medicine facilities. Our radio pharmacies are located in Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth. And we've also got a manufacturing facility, RadPharm, which is in Canberra, and that produces radiopharmaceutical cold kits. Now, our facilities are either GMP or GMP standard clean room facilities, and we have approximately 120 staff Australia-wide. Now, our staff include our production staff, very highly trained radiochemists and radiopharmacists, but we also have a big group of experts in compliance, quality, validation, regulatory affairs, and pharmacovigilance. Our facilities are a mix. They're a mix of among the TGA, with our Melbourne, Adelaide and Canberra facilities being practice of pharmacy, and the remainder of the facilities are GMP. Now, this mix does give us an ability, for example, to rapidly engage in things like early stage clinical trial production at our practice of pharmacy sites. And then we can pivot to, at this stage, limited GMP production for later stages. So we have got some flexibility with clinical trial work, but the thing that does hold us up is really we're at capacity just with our routine clinical work at our GMP sites. And so the APME will provide a fantastic opportunity for us to have a site where we can manufacture for later stage clinical trials under GMP. But in addition to our radiopharmacy services, GMSA also provides equipment, including hot cells, radiation detection, instrumentation, transport containers, shielding, and also importantly, we provide radio tracer production equipment like synthesizer units. And additionally, we've got servicing and calibration services, and they offer expertise with a lot of the sort of lab equipment that we'd be installing at the APME. And in particular, we're making a significant. So as I mentioned before, we are part of Global Medical Solutions internationally, which is an international company with headquarters in Los Angeles. And aside from our Australian facilities, we have facilities in New Zealand, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Shanghai, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, the Philippines, and for those of you who don't know where Armenia is, in Armenia as well, that last little red dot in Europe. And our spread of international facilities gives us strong connections and agreements with other international companies in the molecular imaging industry. For example, we have connections and agreements with Comisha, with IRE, with IDB Holland, with Mirion Technologies and Radqual. And also that spread of international facilities does give us access to markets in the Asia Pacific region. So then why would we want to be part of the APME, and why are we involved in the project? Well, what we're doing is we're bringing an industry component to the project. And we joined, as Gary said, with Telix and Monash last year to apply for the Modern Manufacturing Initiative Manufacturing Collaboration Stream grant, administered by the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. And as Gary said, we were successful in that application, and the awarding of the grant was publicly announced by the former Prime Minister, Mr. Morrison, on the 4th of April this year. And now we're just working through the details of that grant with the Department of Industry and refining the agreement so that we can move ahead with the project. And GMSA would bring, as I see it, to the APME a long and deep experience in supplying radiopharmaceuticals to the Australian market. We've got really good relationships and close relationships with our customers. We've got expertise in logistics, not only in the capital cities, but also in regional and rural areas, the hard to reach places. We have got cyclotron experience through our Brisbane operations and also international experience with cyclotrons. We've got expertise in negotiating the Australian regulatory environment, and we do have, as I said before, a strong regulatory and compliance team with really deep knowledge of the relevant regulations that would, for example, be applying to the GMP operations at the APME. And we are very, very strongly committed to the future of nuclear medicine in Australia through our investment already in centralised radiopharmacy. And we have developed expertise in the production of theranostic agents for early stage clinical trials. And through that work, we really developed that understanding of that need to meet the increasing demand for new PET isotopes. From our point of view, the advantage of the APME, well, if nothing else, COVID's taught us that we just can't afford to be dependent on overseas supply of isotopes which are in regular clinical use. The APME does give us the capacity to provide a reliable source of these isotopes, particularly thallium-201 and gallium-67, as Gary referred to, the SPECT isotopes that are in current clinical use. And really, the supply of these has been very, very sketchy for probably more than 12 months, particularly with the pressures internationally from transport and logistics. Also, the APME will future-proof Australian nuclear medicine, and it does ensure that ongoing development that we need to anticipate and plan for new and emerging isotopes, as well as help meet the rapidly growing demand for current isotopes, particularly those that are being used in PET and theranostic areas. And, you know, as an example, back when I was a student, it used to be that gammas were for imaging, betas were for treating, and alphas were for ignoring. And, you know, who'd have thought that the Cinderella alpha emitters would, as it were, put on the glass slipper of usefulness. And now there's an increasing demand for alpha emitting isotopes. And we really need to be ready to pivot for these sorts of things. And it gives you an idea of the rapid evolution and the changes that are occurring in molecular imaging and nuclear medicine. So the APME will help to meet these needs as essentially a kind of a one-stop drive through. Do you want fries with that destination, which will enable us to develop these new diagnostic and therapy agents, basically from inspiration to administration and commercialization. And additionally, the APME will provide a very useful training resource to help us to produce that next generation of people we need to drive that future of molecular imaging and therapy in Australia. And now, as an industry partner, our involvement in this has to make commercial sense, and it does. And we see the APME as giving us the opportunity to address the current gap in the market that's caused by unreliable supply from overseas. It allows us to contribute to servicing the market for PET isotopes, both those that are currently in use and those that are emerging, and also the ones that we might anticipate will become popular in the future. We can use our existing supply networks, and we can pivot from these to help supply locally, but also we have the opportunity then to open up export markets into the Asia Pacific region through our international chain of facilities. Also, the APME allows us to work to bring new radio tracers and therapies to the Australian market within Australia, rather than having to rely on development occurring overseas and us kind of at the end of the the queue waiting for supply of them. So that's a very, very short overview of GMSA and our involvement. In conclusion, I would say we're really, really proud to be in partnership with Telix and Monash University, and both being recognised leaders in pharmaceutical development. We look forward to working with them in the future, and we are really very excited in to be part of creating this world-class facility, which will drive the future of molecular medicine in Australia and ultimately is going to benefit Australian patients. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Thanks very much, Danny. We don't have any questions in our Q&A at the moment, so let's move on to our next presenters from Telix Pharmaceuticals. Firstly, Dr. David Cade, who's the Vice President of Asia Pacific in Telix Pharmaceuticals, and Dr. Jyoti Arora, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Telix in Asia Pacific. So thank you very much, David and Jyoti, for joining our seminar today, and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, and always nice to hear your perspective, Danny. I think, thanks for the very articulate preceding presentations. Yeah, so my objective was to endeavour to communicate why Telix has been so committed to this grant application. We received a phone call from Gary, I think it was about October last year. We had a rush to get this grant application together. I think collectively we did a reasonable job given the successful outcome of the grant. And I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Jyoti Arora, in the commitment she's made to getting this very successful outcome. So why as a partner would Telix be interested? And I'll get to that in a minute, but I think, in a nutshell, Telix is based down here in the bottom right-hand corner in Melbourne, Australia. We are a very long way from supply chains for isotopes and radiopharmaceutical manufacturing facilities that are predominant in the Northern Hemisphere. So this sovereign capability is critically important, not just for Telix, but I think this country, and I'll explain why in a minute. So Telix is a rare beast. It's a radiopharmaceutical company. It's just coming up 6 years old, listed on the local Australian Securities Exchange, and particularly rare because it's a homegrown biotech company that actually has a commercial stage asset. That asset is known as Illuccix, which is a prostate cancer PSMA PET imaging agent. It was approved by our own regulator back in November last year and by the US FDA just prior to Christmas. So a fantastic Christmas present for a biotech to get an FDA approval. And this imaging agent, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, was launched last month in the United States. Last year was a very productive year in nuclear medicine. It is feasible to take non-commercialized assets to patients. So for Illuccix, just over 13,000 patients were imaged in 2021 using this product before it was approved officially by the regulators. Very significant clinical trial portfolio across 8 main disease states. These are all global trials. All necessarily underpinned by a significant distribution network across many regions of the world, APAC, Europe, Middle East, Africa, North America, Latin America, and so forth. But as we'll talk about in a moment, clearly missing the final piece, which is a major radiopharmaceutical manufacturing capability here in Australia to serve not just the Australian domestic market, but ASEAN countries and the broader APAC region. So Telix's pipeline it's a particularly broad pipeline. I think in the time we have today, it's not really feasible to go through all of these assets, but there's 3 key takeaways from this pipeline. I think the first is that Telix has a very broad portfolio of assets across oncology and rare diseases. These scan across prostate cancer, which is the most common cancer in men, through kidney cancer, which obviously affects males and females, to brain cancer or glioblastoma, which is a rare but absolutely devastating illness with a major unmet need. There's about 11,000 cases diagnosed a year in the United States. So that clearly is an underserved market. And then BMC and RD down the bottom signifies bone marrow conditioning and rare diseases. So we've got a very unique asset. We call it Telix 66, which may be deployed in future for bone marrow conditioning. The current way we do it uses a horrible collection of chemotherapy agents that has a high treatment-related toxicity and mortality. So we've got an asset that aims to significantly advance upon what we can do today. So it's a significant portfolio. The second thing I think I would highlight here is that by and large, the imaging assets are developed together with a therapy asset as a theranostic pair. But when we do that, it's almost always the case that the imaging asset leads the development of the therapeutic asset. And you can see that up the top with Illuccix, which has just been approved, as I mentioned, whereas its companion therapeutic that aims to treat those patients that we image will lag by 1 or 2 years as we take it through phase 3 development. And then really the third thing I'd highlight here is that while Telix is at a point where it has just commercialized its first prostate cancer imaging agent, it has a very rapidly following kidney cancer imaging agent known as zirconium-89 girentuximab, or TLX 250 CDX, which is just finishing phase 3 development. So that'll be the second commercialized asset. So how do we make sort of sense of all of this? It's a broad portfolio, 4 main therapy areas, 2 or more assets in each of those therapy areas. How do we aim to make sort of strategic sense of that? So as a drug developer in the radiopharmaceutical sector, what we aim to do is to get to revenue. And I think for a biotech company founded 6 years ago, listed on the ASX in 2017, the path to revenue has been extraordinarily fast. So we've just launched Illuccix, and that will enable Telix to establish itself as a leader in urologic oncology. But of course, you don't go to market with the expectation of having only one asset in the market. So our phase 3 asset, the kidney cancer imaging agent, will enable Telix to build a high-value diagnostic portfolio that meet these significant unmet needs in imaging in the urologic oncology space. That's not my view of it. That second asset was granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA just over a year ago, and that enables a faster and more efficient path to market in the United States. So that's obviously the second part of the strategic value creation. I think it's important to articulate that Telix is not a pure play imaging company. The benefit to patients ultimately comes from getting therapeutics to market. So we are rapidly advancing our therapeutics. Our most advanced one is our prostate cancer therapeutic that's just going into phase 3 development. And then finally, a pipeline is critical. So while that's an established pipeline at the moment that's quite significant, there's a lot of investment that needs to go into that. That pipeline needs to have new assets dropped into it, at the top end as well. And that's why we're particularly interested in partnering with both Monash and GMS to that end. This is a sort of our attempt at sort of making, sort of outlining the difficulties in radiopharmaceutical finished product manufacturing. And I was at the Australia New Zealand Society of Nuclear Medicine meeting in Brisbane just last weekend, and I heard a colleague mention that manufacturing radiopharmaceuticals is like trying to take ice cream across the desert to the other side without a refrigerated van. It's a very difficult sort of just-in-time manufacturing process. So what we see is top left, we could classify isotopes, not really worrying about what we use them for, but the properties of those isotopes. We see here that there's a number of high utilization isotopes that have very short half-lives, 6 hours for technetium, 110 minutes for fluorine, and 68 minutes for gallium. So these isotopes obviously can't be transported great distances, and hence lend themselves to a network-based manufacturing approach. And that's what we're doing with that first Illuccix asset. I think more more interestingly is the isotopes that have longer half-lives. Yttrium-90 has been in use for many years now, significantly supplanted by lutetium-177, which is a very important isotope to us in TLX-250 for kidney therapy and TLX-591 for prostate therapy. But also some of the imaging isotopes like zirconium-89 have longer half-lives as well. So these lend themselves naturally, because of their half-life, to a centralized manufacturing approach. And really, each of these, from our point of view, can and will be manufactured. It's obviously indicative because we haven't gone through the detail yet, but each of these have the possibility and the potential to be manufactured at the APME. But on the top right, it's those longer half-life isotopes that we would envisage being made there, and critically important because most of these isotopes otherwise, originate from the Northern Hemisphere. We've got some jewels in the crown like ANSTO that supply lutetium into the market. That's a very important jewel in the crown that we have here. But zirconium, for example, in our phase 3 trial, caused us major problems because it originated from Toronto in Canada. So having that sovereign reliability of supply is critical for a finished drug manufacturer like Telix. And then I think, no discussion on such a significant facility would be complete without, describing where will these assets ultimately be taken. And I think it's important to make the case that while Australian patients, and in the first instance, Australian men, for example, with prostate cancer are very important, from a large facility like this, working with partners like GMS, who we've worked with now for 7 or 8 years, working with Monash, who we've worked with probably a bit longer. These assets aim to be taken not just to Australia and New Zealand, but to significant markets in the ASEAN countries, but also the very large markets like China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and India. And I'll just give you a snapshot of why they're interesting. Telix was able to secure a partner in China Grand Pharma, a couple of years back. That was a $300 million transaction for us, so very important that we serve that market. China does not have significant radiopharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities, so very important that we have the ability to serve that significant market from Australia. And then at the other end of the spectrum is India. I think it's another very interesting case example. There's about 80 million people in India, out of a population of 1.4 billion, that have the same insured level or the self-pay capacity that we have here in Australia or in another Western developed market. So these are significant markets in India where there's a large population of patients that have access to state-of-the-art radiopharmaceuticals. And, while that sounds inequitable, Telix as a radiopharmaceutical company has a tiered approach to making sure that no patient is left behind. So using those other isotopes, we have ways of making imaging and therapy available to patients that don't have the ability to pay high Western style prices. But these are all very important markets that Gary, Danny, Jyoti and I really look forward to serving in our region, from the APME. So with that, Gary, I think that's a whistle-stop tour of what we're trying to achieve from this very significant facility, but always happy to take questions. Back to you.
Thank you very much, David. That was very, very interesting. I do have some questions, but from the audience right now, we don't have any. So let's then move on to the last presentation in the seminar, which is from Dr. Maggie Aulsebrook, who's the head of the radiochemistry team here at Monash Biomedical Imaging and a senior research fellow in the Department of School of Chemistry. Maggie recently joined MBI, coming back from her position over at the UCSF. So we're delighted that you're on the team now, Maggie, leading the chemistry team, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for the introduction. So my part of this webinar is going to cover the research opportunities offered by the radiochemistry platform at MBI, a part of the APME venture. So I just want to quickly start by giving an overview of my scientific background and how that relates to the research goals of the APME. I completed my PhD at Monash University in the area of chemistry. I then took up a postdoctoral research fellow position at Shimi Paris Tech in the development of zirconium-89 based PET imaging agents for evaluation in clinical trials. And this was my start in the nuclear medicine field. After this, I then moved to ANSTO as a research radiochemist, where my research spanned preclinical, clinical, and commercial work. To interface more closely with the clinic, I then moved to the UCSF radiopharmaceutical facility, which is a cyclotron facility and focused on the development of clinical translation of GMP grade research radiopharmaceuticals for first in human and investigational studies. And I'm now back at Monash University with MBI, working a part of the team to help bring the vision of the APME to life and driving products into the clinic during that process. I just want to quickly highlight the facilities that will be available at the APME, dedicated specifically for research purposes in order to enable access to cyclotron-produced radioisotopes, GMP-grade radiopharmaceuticals, and aid in their development. So the APME will have dedicated radiochemistry research and development facilities, as well as GMP-compliant production facilities for the delivery of GMP-grade radiopharmaceuticals to late-stage clinical trials, once licensed, of course. But together, these aspects of the facility will provide crucial infrastructure for to allow Australia to become world leaders in the clinical evaluation of radiopharmaceuticals. So taking that back to the overall network within the MBI precinct, to provide, I guess, a more holistic view, it means that we are able to deliver to each stage along this drug development pipeline, allowing for the development of radiopharmaceuticals to be fast-tracked and translated into the clinic with ease. We have the expertise to develop the radiochemistry to label a wide range of substrates. MBI has the capability to complete preclinical evaluation in-house, and radiopharmaceuticals can then be prepped and translated to the clinic for delivery to phase 1 and subsequent phase 2 and 3 clinical trials. And while the Monash team, will focus on the first 5 bricks of this pipeline, there will also be an element of commercial production, which will be managed by the commercial operator GMS, who we are very proud to be working alongside of. The facility as a whole will provide access to a range of PET and SPECT radionuclides. I'm focusing on the smaller cyclotron in this slide and what PET radioisotopes we will aim to access. It's probably no surprise we will be producing carbon-11 and fluorine-18. With the Heart Hospital in such close proximity, we are also considering producing nitrogen-13, and iodine-124 is also of interest. The radiometals we aim to produce are gallium-68, zirconium-89, and copper-64. I wanted to briefly highlight routine radiopharmaceuticals that I have intimate experience in the clinical production and QC of. My primary role has always been radiopharmaceutical development, but I've also been required to be involved in what I would consider routine production. So I have experience in DMET, ammonia, FDG, FDOPA, FASA, FES, FET, fluorocholine, FEREG. Yeah, they're on the slide, but the purpose of this slide is to give this audience an idea of the radiopharmaceuticals which can easily be implemented and offered from the Monash side once the APME comes online. So if you are interested in accessing any of these drugs for clinical application, please do reach out to us so we can appropriately prioritize the implementation. But I envisage that most of these drugs, given my experience with them, could be available within a year of commissioning the facility, depending on the clinical interest. As I mentioned, I specialize in the development and clinical translation of radiopharmaceuticals. I can't talk about specifics and structures of what products I have developed because I've always worked in a user platform capacity and dealt with the translational side. But broadly speaking, I've developed radiopharmaceutical products, which were small molecules, antibodies, proteins, and peptides for human administration with a wide range of radiohalogens and radiometals. And I've led the development of a number of investigational radiopharmaceuticals for first-in-human application, and successfully led the manufacturing and QC side of the regulatory approval for clinical studies. I've summarized what I think the development process looks like to give you more of an idea of the whole process. I also want to take this opportunity to highlight my experience and expertise, and thus communicate what services we can offer to you as a user platform. Generally, when developing a product, I would start by developing the radiolabeling and purification process from scratch. Subsequent stability and formulation studies would then be performed. Manual production is possible, but typically for clinical production, it would be translated onto a synthesizer, which includes writing the sequence myself. I develop the QC protocols and release criteria, and we then work with the PIs on the approval for the study to proceed, including SOP, drafting, validation runs, and submissions to regulatory bodies. And once that approval has been granted, we would then proceed to clinical production runs. And the radiochemistry platform at MBI can work with users to deliver radiopharmaceutical products and provide advice on any aspect along this workflow. During the interim period, while the APME facility is being built and commissioned, the radiochemistry platform at MBI will be focusing on the development of radiopharmaceuticals and the delivery to early phase clinical trials. We will be fostering a strong relationship with the radioisotopes team at ANSTO, led by Lena Hogan. My research interests align with the development of theranostics, and plan on working with Lena's team at ANSTO to further the utility of theranostic pairs. We have had a few requests for specific labeled molecules by research groups at Monash and Monash Health. So we are currently working with these groups to deliver these radiopharmaceuticals to the clinic. And the last thing that I have to say is that if you have radiopharmaceutical products you would like developed, please do reach out to us to explore options for collaboration with the radiochemistry platform at MBI. And if you would like to follow the project, please do so. There are various platforms to advertise progress of the APME shown in this slide. And if you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. So I'm just handing it now back to you, Gary.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Maggie. I think we're in pretty good time, actually, which is good. So thanks to our speakers, and we'll now turn it over to a panel discussion. So I'll invite David and Jyoti to also come back on the screen. We have now a couple of questions coming from the audience. So let me read them out, and we'll find out who should respond to this. So the first question is from Devesh. Is production of astatine-211 a consideration in the new facility? So perhaps, Danny, from your perspective at GMS, has that been given any consideration or airtime thus far?
At the early stages, we haven't necessarily considered it, but we're open to, production of any new or novel isotope for which there's a demand. Mm-hmm. So if there's a demand out there, we'll certainly look for a way to.
And Maggie, do you have any response to that query? Your thoughts around having that in the research and development?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on demand for the radioisotope. So if if there's anyone who wants a specific radioisotope, please do reach out to us and we can start that conversation.
Yep. So definitely looking for feedback from users, research and clinical users. We have another question here from Ian Harding. Other than copper-64, will there be opportunities for generation of other shorter half-life copper isotopes, such as copper-61 with a better emission profile?
I guess it kind of feeds back to the, response that we just had. If there is, need and requests, we can always have that conversation. But yeah, please do reach out to us.
So I think, Danny, the capacity for producing, say, copper-61, that is feasible on the large cyclotron, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe it is, Gary. And I think these questions highlight really one of the things we want from the APME, and that is we're looking for that kind of feedback from the nuclear medicine community, for people to come to us and say, hey, can you do this for us? And, create that kind of relationships with the nuclear medicine community.
So I think the answer is in principle, yes. And please make direct contact with Danny and Maggie. Then we have another question around the availability of iodine 123, given the clear supply constraints that exist. So I'll pass that one over to you, Danny.
Yeah, again, I-123 is definitely on the radar already for what we're doing, and I understand the frustrations that people have had with the limited supply of I-123 as a radiochemical, and also its I-123 MIBG. We'll certainly be looking at both of those.
So that's probably early stage in the GMP manufacturing from the 30 MeV.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great. So if there are any more questions from the audience, please pop them in the Q&A. Look, I had a couple of questions. I was interested, Danny, to understand your sort of strategy, I guess, from GMS in regards to the existing 30 MeV cyclotron that you operate in Taiwan. I understand that's been around for a couple of decades or so, and I'm just wondering how you see the APME cyclotron working together with the Taiwanese facility.
Good question. Our colleagues in Taiwan are already providing us with support and advice for this project, but we would most definitely see that there's still needs in the Taiwan market that probably aren't fully met by our colleagues over there, and we would be looking to assist them in capturing that market.
So there's a sort of unmet demand there in Southeast Asia, even
certainly is.
with that 30 MeV running in Taiwan.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's good to know. So does anybody else on the panel have a question or comment?
Gary, just me back to you now, or back to you and Maggie, but I know Monash has got a very strong pharmaceutical involvement and commitment, and would you see the facility as offering any formal training for radiochemists, radiopharmacists, as well as research?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Thanks, Danny. I can mention that there has been a lot of effort from within Monash to lead the establishment of a training centre, industrial transformation training centre, led from the School of Chemistry. Andrea Robinson there has led a team, including people from Melbourne Uni and Sydney University, to form a PhD training program in radiochemistry and radiopharmaceutical technologies. So we're waiting to hear the outcome of our current application in that regard, but we're very hopeful that will be successful. And what it's really demonstrated to us is, apart from GMS and Telix's investments in this area, there's many other companies looking to partner with universities to invest in training of PhD graduates and other technical specialists. There's clearly a real massive need for that, and a dearth of qualified applicants. So that's in the mix, and we hope that will come forward shortly. Maggie, did you have any other comment there around training opportunities in the APME?
Yeah, I mean, I think training is really important, especially when there are, I guess, shortages in this field. So we definitely want to be involved in training the next generation of young scientists.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we have a couple of more comments, I guess, in the Q&A. So one from Hannah. Thank you, Hannah, that we do need to expand our discussions of the research opportunities, particularly around heart disease and heart disease prevention and treatment in Australia. So we'll look forward to doing that with the Victorian Heart Institute. And we have a question from someone regarding the fact that research program looks pretty ambitious. I guess the question broadly there, Maggie, is how do we see this evolving sort of over the next 3 years as the APME is built, and then beyond that?
So in terms of research traces, I guess, obviously there's not a lot you can do until the facility is actually commissioned and built, but it's, in the next 4 years, it's just about doing everything that we can to be in the best place to efficiently and quickly offer those traces to the clinic.
Perhaps the other thing to add there is that the scope of the work Maggie outlined does include, a number of academics from the School of Chemistry, PhD students, colleagues from the Monash Institute for Pharmaceutical Sciences as well, who are very active in the development of new drugs. So it's not just
it's not just clinical,
the labs at MBI itself, but there's a lot of people working in these disciplines. And we have a comment just come through, David, to Telix about whether or not copper-64 centralized production is viable. Perhaps you'd like to respond to that. The question is, isn't this already the US model, and is it working in your view to have a copper-64 centralized production?
Yeah, look, that's an excellent question. I thank the question. We have one asset that is currently using copper-64 in our portfolio, but it's being used primarily to ascertain the biodistribution of that asset. So, Danny, you're well aware of it. That asset is for prostate cancer. It's being used over at a Genesis Care facility in Perth, where our lead investigator is on that phase 1 study. It's called the Cupid trial. And the copper-64 labelling is done at the GMS Radiopharmacy in Melbourne, and then it gets shipped over to Perth. But the reason we are using copper-64 is solely for that research purpose and the elucidation of the biodistribution of that targeting vector, which is a monoclonal antibody that we have optimized. If the preliminary work from that imaging study supports further work for that targeting vector, we will label it with actinium-225 and take that into our first-in-human therapeutic trial using alpha therapy. The only other thing I'd add is that for Illuccix, our imaging isotope is gallium-68. That's a network model. The way we've gone to market in the United States is via a commercial radiopharmacy network provider, Cardinal Health and Pharmalogic, and a couple more, using gallium generators by and large. They're in their nuclear pharmacy networks. They've got about 140 nuclear pharmacies around the country. And the radio labeling is done there and then taken to the patient within a 1 hour radius. So for us, I know we've got a peer group company in Australia that is using copper-60 more widely than us. We're using it for research purposes only. But they've got their views on that, and they're probably well founded as well.
I think also, David, it's fair to say that when we're talking about centralised supply, our experience with trying to ship something across Australia is that we probably don't have as much opportunity or as much access to airlines and flights as you might have in the US, and sort of the shortage of airlines, and that exacerbated by COVID-19 and the kind of Democratic People's Republic of Western Australia with a demilitarised zone making it difficult for us to get in there, didn't really help. And that there are practical reasons why the centralised model is a little bit difficult for copper-64, and it's more around logistics than anything else.
Yeah, Danny, I'd say that would extend out to most parts, actually all of the US as well. As an industry, we've become really good at moving fluorine-18 around, but that required years of setting up networks to be able to facilitate and essentially, race against the decaying, the decay time essentially. And I think we need to do the same thing for copper. Its profile is different, its half-life is different, and the same networks that are there for fluorine are not suitable for copper-64. But I think it's something that the industry does realize and has realized, and it's probably something that will move towards. And it's flight and movement and the supply chain that is problematic. And having done that for a very long time, we do see that. We even see that in long-lived isotopes as well.
Great, thank you, Jyoti. I think that's addressed that point very well. I think we've probably pretty much come to the end of our questions and our panel discussion. It's been great having this session. I've really, really enjoyed it myself, and I'm sure our audience are still hanging on. So I think it's really been of interest to our community. Look, I'd like to thank Danny Bucki-Smith from Global Medical Solutions, David Cade and Jyoti Arora from Telix Pharmaceuticals, and Maggie Aulsebrook from Monash University for their presentations. And thank the audience for their attention and for questioning. And please join us with our next MBI seminar that you'll see coming out on the social media. So thanks everyone for joining in, and have a good day. Thank you.